вітаємо всіх, хто зібрався на 4-му Медіадні Премії імені Георгія Ґонґадзе. На початку, як я вже сказала, буде кілька слів, кілька речень українською мовою про ту подію, на якій ми сьогодні зібралися. І далі попереджу тих, хто вмикається онлайн, що у нас сьогодні подія буде англійською мовою. Отже, хочу нагадати, що сьогодні розпочинається публічна програма 4-го Медіадня Премії імені Георгія Ґонґадзе. Я впевнена, що всі, хто тут зібрався і всі, хто дивиться нас онлайн, знають, що премія імені Георгія Ґонґадзе була заснована 18-го року Українським ПЕН у партнерстві з Києво-Могилянською бізнес-школою, Асоціацією випускників Києво-Могилянської бізнес-школи та виданням «Українська правда». Для нас дуже важливо наголошувати, що премія, яка носить ім'я Георгія Ґонґадзе, підтримується спільнотою відповідального бізнесу в Україні. Якщо говорити про сам Медіадень, то Медіадень з'явився 2020 року в нашій спільноті, в спільноті премії. І наше головне завдання було говорити про тенденції і виклики, з якими стикається українська та світова журналістика. Очевидно, що цього року, через рік після того, як Росія розпочала повномасштабну війну проти України, ми говоримо в рамках Медіадня також про те, як змінилося сприйняття України у світі за цей рік. І, звичайно, ми говоримо про тих наших колег, які сьогодні відстоюють свободу України на фронті, тих колег, які також стали за цей рік воєнними кореспондентами. І для нас дуже важливо щодня в рамках цієї події нагадувати вам, що це рік величезних втрат для української і світової журналістики, оскільки після 24 лютого 2022 року на війні, яку Росія розв'язала проти України, загинуло 48 українських та іноземних медійників. Дуже коротко перед тим, як ще збирається онлайн-аудиторія, я також хочу вам нагадати, що сьогодні у нас буде подія англійською мовою, і ми матимемо ще один насичений день завтра. О 12-й годині ми будемо зустрічати тут, у Києво-Могилянській бізнес-школі, українських журналістів військових і українських воєнних кореспондентів і прес-офіцерів. Цю подію модеруватиме Ольга Сніцарчук, і відразу після неї, о 2-й годині, ми будемо чекати тут Мирославу Барчук, яка говоритиме про те, як війна, воєнний контекст перекроїли українське медіаполе. І ми запросили до цієї розмови українських журналістів і політиків, щоб поговорити про виклики і проблеми в нашому медіасередовищі. А зараз я дуже хочу передати слово Володимиру Єрмоленку, українському журналісту, філософу, письменнику, президенту Українського ПЕН, який уже представить вам наших спікерів. I would like to give the floor to Володимир Єрмоленко, Ukrainian philosopher, journalist, writer and president of PEN Ukraine. Volodymyr will introduce you our speakers.
Дякую, Таня. Thank you, Tanya. It's a great honor to make this discussion within Ґонґадзе Prize. This is a very big prize for PEN Ukraine and for the whole Ukrainian society. And I'm very glad that we talk about the global role, global meaning of what is happening today. So I'm happy to introduce our guests, our panelists, who are both international and Ukrainian journalists. And I will go one by one. Krістофер Міллер, who has been reporting about Russian invasion since 2014, and who was reporting about Ukraine even earlier, as far as I remember. He worked for Radio Free Europe, then he worked for BuzzFeed, and now you work for Financial Times. Is that correct? That's right. Anna Mиронюк, who represents Kyiv Independent, the Kyiv Independent, which is a very young but very successful Ukrainian media, English-speaking media. Welcome. Наталя Гуменюк, one of the best Ukrainian journalists and who was founder of Громадське, and now she's founder of Public Interest Journalism Lab. A fantastic team who is doing lots of work not only in reporting but also in documenting war crimes. And Natalia is also writing a lot for international media. And doing the projects which are, pitching the stories from Ukraine for international media, for top international media, and this is very important. Tetiana Oharkova, who represents Ukraine Crisis Media Center, also very successful media organization from 2014. And Tetiana heads the international department of Ukraine Crisis Media Center. This is constant reporting, but also Tanya is very often present in the international media, primarily the French-speaking media, and I hope we will also talk about the specificity of different languages. And Luc Gardinဃ from The Guardian, and the author of this fantastic book that you can find on the table, which is called Invasion, which is one of the most successful books about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Luc, thank you so much. My first question will be to our international guests, Luc and Christopher. Maybe we'll start with you, Luc. This is history, and our panel is called Here the History is Running, we can say. What does it mean to be, for you, to report from Ukraine and about Russian invasion? How would you define this history? Because I remember that even a few years ago, Peter Pomerantsov told me that, look, he's preparing a book about Ukraine, and the publisher was very surprised that he's preparing a book about Ukraine. It was a few years ago, and I think you probably will tell me that, like some 10 years ago, reporting from Ukraine about Ukraine would be very much strange, and you would hardly find an opportunity to report. Now, this is the top topic in international media. What is it like for you?
Yeah, hello. Very nice to see everybody here this evening, and thank you so much for inviting us. I mean, I think you're right. Actually, I mean, I was the Guardian's Moscow correspondent between 2007 and 2011, and Kyiv, if I'm honest, was regarded as a sort of sidearm of the Russia story. So you would spend most of your time in Moscow, you would do the odd trip to Kamchatka or Siberia, and then every so often you would fly to Kyiv because there was an election, and you'd have to try and explain to an Anglophone audience about sort of venomous Ukrainian politics, that you know, Yushchenko and Tymoshenko were allies, and then they weren't allies anymore, and then there was this guy Yanukovych, and he seemed to be backed by Russia, and it was it was confusing, and I think Ukraine was seen in the kind of context of Russia rather than its own story. I mean, what struck me as a reporter going on side trips from Moscow 15 years ago was that as soon as I touched down at the airport in Kyiv, things felt freer. Even back then, that there was, in the way that was not true in the sort of darkening Russia of Vladimir Putin, there was a conversation. I mean, quite often it was a sort of shouty conversation or an oligarch-inflected conversation, but there were rival channels, there was discourse, there was a sort of pluralism which was missing from Russian society. And I sort of think, just to go to your question about history, I mean, I mean, I take no pleasure in saying this, but some of us have been writing about, including Chris, very well and very, very brilliant. Some international journalists have been writing about the fact that the kind of Russian regime of Vladimir Putin was not merely a kind of domestically oppressive regime that would beat up its own people, but was adventurous, was dangerous, reckless, and really wanted to kind of chew up European borders. And when I was in Moscow, I sort of covered the invasion of Georgia. I was in Tbilisi, following Russian tanks down the road. And then in about 2010, just before I was kicked out of Russia, I went to Crimea because there was a lot of conversation about Crimea could be the next Georgia. And I wrote a counterfactual piece for The Guardian about how easy it would be to run the Russian tricolor above Sevastopol. So there was a clear direction of travel. And I would just say, I would say that I think we international journalists, I'm not just speaking for myself, I think we got better at reporting Ukraine. I think we started off, we were quite bad. There was a big issue with spelling. For a long time, we were spelling Kyiv, K-I-E-V. I was lobbying The Guardian, certainly from before 2014, but intensively after 2014. I mean, like Chris and like most of the panel, I was in Donetsk and Luhansk, reporting on this Russian spring, if you can call it that. And I sort of said, look, we've got to shift from Kyiv to Kyiv. And I had an email from the person who's in charge of our style guide, and he said, well, we can make the change when things calm down politically in the region. And I said, look, they're never going to calm down politically. We just have to do it because it's the right thing to do. We've done it with India. We don't call Chennai Madras. We don't call Mumbai Bombay. This is a sovereign country. There's a shift going on. We have to reflect that. We only.
But the French still write Kyiv, and the Germans as well.
We can lay that crime against Tatiana in a minute. I'm still struggling. I mean, just between ourselves. No one please tweet this, but we've now adopted Ukrainian spellings for practically everything. With my book Invasion, we took absolute pains to make sure everything was properly Ukrainized. There were people I talked to when I was writing this book who emailed me halfway through and said they had themselves changed the spelling of their names. People in Kyiv, and so it's hard. And our current battle is over Dnipro, the river. Right? So I spell it D-N-I-P-R-O, and our style guide says no, D-N-I-E-P-E-R, and we're still having furious internal emails about this. I say it's wrong, it's ridiculous.
So we need to launch a campaign, Dnipro, not Dnieper.
We need to Dniperize the Dnipro. And so, that's a kind of micro example, but generally, I would say, just to wind up, I think, together with other Ukrainian colleagues, I think we've done a pretty good job. We haven't done a perfect job, but we've been here, we've traveled to the front line, we have tried to report fairly and accurate, we have tried to ignore the noise coming from Russian propaganda, from Russian trolls, from disinformation, from malign actors in our own society, and from rogue Europeans like the Prime Minister of Hungary. And I think we're doing okay. Could we do better? Yeah, we could, but has it been okay so far? I think it has.
Christopher, when we come back to the years that when we come back to the years 2000s, right? And Luke mentioned this invasion of Georgia. I think every Ukrainian, I hope, that is in his whole will confirm that we really perceived it as a first step and Ukraine will be next. And we perceived it as a big history. And I still doubt that people in the West perceived it as a big history that covers the whole Europe or the whole democratic world. And at the same time, even now, I still feel it that it is presented sometimes, the local conflict, maybe Ukraine's fight against Russia for its independence. Of course, this is the war for Ukrainian independence, but it has much bigger influence. It's the fight of the democratic world against autocracies. So do you feel that it is changing right now, that people understand how global it is?
We're getting there, I think. Well, first of all, the invasion of Georgia was a little bit before my time. Not to.
But it was after you were born, right?
Right. I was just starting out in journalism at that point, and still very much in the United States. I came over here in 2010, not by choice, and with no connections here, but very quickly found my way. I do think that, this is an hours and hours long conversation about how Ukraine has changed since 2010, or even in the last 5 years, right? But it's changed by magnitudes over the last 13 years that I've been here. And I do think that one major change is what you've sort of put your finger on, and that is that the world knows where Ukraine is now. I think, myself included. Like I said, I was sent here not by...
You mean that Ukraine is everywhere?
Ukraine is everywhere. Actually, when I go home to visit my family in New York, and I'm out walking through the park or any of the neighborhoods, the number of Ukrainian flags that I see outnumbers the number of American flags that I see now. And I was telling somebody this anecdote just a few days ago, and I think I may have tweeted it because somebody, a Ukrainian journalist colleague, mentioned something about the Ukrainian flag being everywhere. And my family lives in Oregon on the west coast of the United States, and my dad was looking for a Ukrainian flag to hang at their home. And he went into this flag shop, and the guy said, "Unfortunately, we're sold out." He said, "You're sold out of Ukrainian flags?" He said, "Yeah, we're sold out of Ukrainian flags. This is the second time." And so my dad put his name down on a waiting list to get a Ukrainian flag. Anyway, it's just an example of, I think, how prevalent Ukraine is in the international community, how much it's being thought about, of course.
But it's very interesting, sorry I interrupt you, because the question is, we all seen so many Ukrainian flags. The question is, what is it sign of? Is it a sign of sympathy, like compassion, or it's sign of, okay, these guys are doing something that we are part of it?
Well, I think a lot of the world, I'll speak about my country, the United States, looks at Ukraine and what has happened here over the past year, and I would venture to say most Americans, because of course there are some that would maybe not agree with this, but most Americans look at Ukraine and they are inspired by what they see. A lot of us Americans have and still do take freedom and democracy for granted, and right now what you see here are people literally putting themselves on the line for freedom and democracy. And I think that for Americans, those two things are very, very, very important to them. And they say that they are, but they don't, necessarily practice it or show that often, right? But what they're seeing here in Ukraine is certainly inspiring. And I think just to go back to like your original question of history, they look at what is happening here, as do those across Europe, and they see history being made. Now we don't know where it's going to end up, and history doesn't end, right? But this is certainly shaping up to be a very key chapter, and there are a lot of eyes on Ukraine right now, waiting to see what happens. And one thing that President Zelensky has said, and many of my Ukrainian friends, is that whatever the world, whatever happens here in Ukraine is going to play a big part in whatever our world, our international society looks like for generations to come.
Yeah, I would agree with you, because I think that the destiny of lots of countries now depend on Ukraine. The destiny of Belarus, the destiny of Georgia, the destiny of Syria maybe, the destiny of all the countries who went through the Arabic Spring. So we really should, I think, look at what is happening now in a much bigger scale, not only such regional conflict, because it's of course a global conflict. Let me address to my Ukrainian friends. Initially, I forgot to tell you that I'm not only president of PEN Ukraine, but also chief editor of Ukraine World, which is also an English language magazine, website by Internews Ukraine. So we are actually making the same job, and I think we're making kind of facing the same challenges. And the challenge is, of course, to convey the Ukrainian message, to tell the Ukrainian story. And I will ask first Natalia, because this year you were publishing a lot, like big pieces in international media, which is kind of not very easy for Ukrainian journalists, because obviously key international media like The Guardian, Financial Times, they rely on your own journalists, right? And it is quite difficult, for a Ukrainian journalist to write a story and being published on a top page, etc. How you achieve that, and do you think that it is sustainable? So do you think we're already on that stage that we can continue with this?
I do believe that the quality is the only reason, to be honest, and I'm speaking not myself, but about the general work. But I think that there were a couple of things which developed within this year, so we shouldn't underestimate this couple of months before the beginning of the full-scale invasion. I think we were all in Kyiv a bit laughing about foreign reporters reporting about preparation of the war from Kyiv cafes. I think there was this kind of running joke how for 2 months there were reporters trying to report something when nothing was happening generally. But in the end, it worked well, because I remember when I heard one of the interviews of one of the kind of a famous American reporter who was for the first time in Ukraine back then. Usually the frontline reporters come to the place which is already devastated. So they are coming this kind of from peaceful place to already this devastated country. And they don't really understand that it was different, that it was like their home. In this time, I felt a lot of foreign reporters who were not in Ukraine by that time felt like, wow, it happened in Kyiv where we spent these nice months and it was okay, it can happen everywhere. And again, this couple of months has helped a lot because there was not much to report. They were doing stories about the language, about 8 years of war. It's like there was a homework done, and already on 24th, the top media were needed to report on the war. Then it was a weird period when, you know, in order to make a story and be on the front page for CNN, you need to be just in Kyiv. You actually need to speak. That's enough. The story shouldn't be good. It just should be, you know, should be on the right on the place. So, and then, of course, it stopped to be worked, and then the good journalism was back, because you, in fact, need to make a good story. But I think it worked, and also there are some objective reasons. So, first of all, compared to a lot of, the wars usually are happening in closed societies, in the countries where there is limited access, where it's very expensive to come, where, you know, like you pay $1,000 for a fixer, like in Syria. So there is a very limited amount of people coming. This war is unusual because it's war in the democracy, in a transparent country, where actually, which is accessible even with the train. So it's super cheap to come. You can be a freelancer, come. You can come wherever, and you can report from here. You know, so in the end, that's partially the reason why also there were so many people, and when there are others, the story is there as well. You know, it's like everybody publishing, so it means it remains on the top page. The second something which I also thought a lot, I think that the interest to Ukraine also coming to what yesterday during press conference President Zelensky told, nobody likes losers. You know, and in a way I felt that there is some compassion fatigue, not to Ukraine, but the compassion fatigue because of the conflicts. People, you know, they feel hopeless. You watch another news from Syria, and there is a limit. You see that it's a kind of hopeless cause. I'm not telling that, but I'm generally saying how the public feels. So it's pretty unusual to see the war in our world for the last decades when, in fact, people are gaining something. It's pretty a different thing. You know, so it's the war in Ukraine is not just a tragedy, but an inspiration. And usually when I'm asked about the fatigue and something, so I was asked a lot, you know, how to report the conflict constructively, you know, how to not make people, you know, fight this compassion fatigue. I said, like, I'm not writing to, you know, ask for pity. I'm writing not really to inspire, you know, I'm writing, but the stories are inspiring, because you can be tired of tragedy. You cannot be tired of inspiration. You know, so that's probably the secret for Ukraine. But for me, I think that indeed there was also the development, and I do think the world is more open for the local voices. But it's true that we needed to fight for that, because at first you kind of an exotic voice. Oh, there is a girl from Ukraine. Maybe she would write something just because we need somebody from Ukraine to write for us, and it would look good. But if you write something which the other journalists don't write, and I'll be open. Yesterday we discussed. Luke actually helped me to you know, copy-edit the article, the opinion I wrote for the Guardian for the first time, because we physically met. And you said that, you know, as a Ukrainian, I can be more nuanced. I can tell something. You know, I was writing about the feeling of guilt, what Ukrainians feeling, that the foreigner won't get. I mean, but you really need to write it, you know, in a way that it's something new, and you have your exclusiveness, you have some other stories maybe where the other foreign reporters don't have. So, but we needed also to fight, because I said we had a pretty difficult period as well with the Reckoning Project. This is a project where we document war crimes. We have some star reporters like Janine Di Giovanni or Peter Pomerantsev in the team, but in the end, this is the stories made for the Ukrainian magazines. And it needed time to explain for the Time magazine, for the Atlantic, that it's not just kind of an opinion piece somewhere, a local voice, but we're doing, you know, a project where the visual quality is exactly the same as if your team would be doing. And I think for us, it's still, we need to be a few steps ahead. We need to have a high quality, more exclusive. So, you know, you really need to be way better, and then it works. But final, I would return to the language. I think it was really I didn't have this struggle because I remember I was writing the first story because Kyiv, everybody agreed on Kyiv, but Odessa with one S is still kind of a thing. And I was filing the first story for the Rolling Stone about Odessa, I think March 3rd, something like very early. And I just thought like, I'll write it and like with top saying like, you know, Ukrainian spelling, it's sensitive. It matters, and I was very clear that the editors never really, you know, rebel. They actually always, you know, write it in exactly the way I sent to them. Even Dnipro, there is one word, one place we need to fight still. It's Chernobyl. You want this battle? Good. We're still not everywhere. Yeah.
I'm guilty of still spelling it the old way.
Yeah, because it's Chernobyl.
So it's one important thing I memorized is that Luke can help actually edit the op-ed for the Guardian, right?
If you want to write something, I'm your man.
Copy editor. You can have Luke as your copy editor. That's really.
I think there is a very important point that Natalia made is actually about inspiration, and you talk a lot with the French audiences and Francophone audiences, and not only in France but in Belgium, in Switzerland, in Canada. You're very, very much present in the Francophone Canada. And the Francophone world is different than the English-speaking world.
There's even more problems with spelling, right?
More problems with spelling, but not only, because the French, obviously, they tend to look in the North Africa, in the Middle East. They kind of didn't really notice Eastern Europe for a very long time. So what are the challenges that you find talking with the Francophone world?
Well, I'll start with spelling problems because we already discussed it. So in French language, yes, indeed, until now, we are struggling to get Kyiv, not Kyiv. And just today, I watched a video on a French TV. It was Catherine Deneuve, this famous French actress, reading Lesia Ukrainka. Maybe somebody of you seen it. Lesia Ukrainka, her first poem written when she was 9 years old, translated into French language, very beautiful translation. So she's in the studio and she's reading it, and there is a Dnipro and she says Dniepr. And everybody's so pathetic about Lesia Ukrainka being present on French TV, a big channel, Catherine Deneuve, etc. But it's not Dnipro, about river, but it's not Dnipro, but Dniepr. Well, so I was a little bit upset. So, but now remember just yesterday, we were preparing a big discussion with Ukrainian deputies and me, so for RFI, Radio France Internationale radio. And I just, when we had some preliminary talks, journalists say, look, you can talk, you can spell it Kyiv, but we'll prefer Kyiv, and you will be talking Kyiv, so we'll be just exchanging about the same city, but I was pronouncing Kyiv, and they were talking Kiev. Well, so we still have those problems, but when in published pieces, I published a couple of pieces during this year, they have no problems accepting Kyiv. So I would say that things are changing. If we're talking about more general things, yes, indeed, in French-speaking media, there are a lot of problems of this visibility of Ukraine. So when we started in 2014, so I became active in the journalism in 2014 in the Ukraine Crisis Media Center. It was a very real struggle because there were many subjects they would like to talk about Russia. They would like to talk about that Crimea is a closed topic. They would discuss Donbass as a separatists or just against civil war or a lot of things like that. But things are progressively changing during these months. So starting from the full-scale invasion, we see that they tend to talk much more about Ukraine, and mostly I would agree with what Volodya said about this victimization. So what people like to see, they would like to see that democracies are strong. And this is true, I think, not only for France, but also for many other countries in Europe. So they think that more you win, so more Ukrainian troops are active and successful on the ground, more coverage it gets for the media. I remember discussing a lot of things with French generals. I'm very much present on these TV shows in French media, so they invite such channels like France 24 and some others, and they invite people from Ukraine, and then they invite their local specialists from think tanks, and they invite generals, these French generals. And we had a lot of discussions, and I do remember there, for example, French generals talking back in April and May, they were saying look, but yes, Ukraine is brave, yes, Ukrainian troops are doing what they can, but look, Russia is big, Russia is powerful, you will never be able to win this game just because Russia is too big, this is a nuclear country, and they have nukes, and they have everything, so you're unable to win that. And we have much less of such talks today for the anniversary of this full-scale invasion. They are trying to present, on the contrary, they're talking about the weakness of Russian army, they're talking about the possibility of the changes in the region, they're talking about Ukrainian identity, they're talking about Ukrainian culture, they ask questions about Ukrainian culture, they quote Lesa Ukrainka on their big channel, and this is somehow surprising. They are trying to, French, if you speak about France, a lot of things function through culture. And today, for example, they're having art galleries and the photo exhibitions of coming from Ukraine. This is very important. So if you come through culture, so these topics are extremely important. So things are changing, they're developing, and they're on the move. And I remember, for example, a couple of days ago, I was talking to a journalist from Switzerland. She's recording podcasts. And they had a journalist here on the front line for many weeks. So this young woman was traveling somewhere in the front lines. And she recorded a podcast, and then there was a question, what else would you like to say about the coverage of Ukraine? And this journalist said, look, so just stop saying that you're tired of Ukraine, just stop it. Stop, because every time you say, look, I don't want to hear any more about Ukraine because this is about victims, this is about war, this is about, I cannot help that. So just stop that, because there are people who can change the situation, and what this journalist from Switzerland witnessed, I see people who can change things, and we all can change things. So I think there's a kind of shift in that not only Ukraine can win this war, but people in European countries, in France, in Switzerland, in Belgium, they don't feel helpless. And this is a huge shift in a way. So they understand that they can help, they can change something, and it makes this coverage of Ukraine important even for them.
Yeah, I would agree with you that I also, sometimes when I was on French television, I was surprised how discourse has changed. For example, how easily the French TV is mocking Russian army and mocking Russian regime, because laughing at Putin, laughing at Russia is also one of the ways to feel your strength. It's another place at the French radio. I was sitting with a French journalist, and I was telling myself, look, he's much more Bandari than I am, you know. He's much more Ukrainian patriot. I mean, not much more, but his rhetoric is so pronounced. But at the same time, I see all the time this discourse that, well, the West is weak, Russia is stronger. So we should rather discuss how. And yesterday, I mean, there was a case, Luke, remember, on that discussion, that how we should prevent Russia from exhausting Ukraine, and not asking the question how we should actually exhaust Russia. And I think there is a long way to go yet in this direction. I don't know whether you agree or not. I would address Anna right now, and my question would be about audience attention. I think we are all kind of these Ukrainian startups which try to reach out for an audience, are struggling with international attention because it comes and goes. I don't know what's your experience. Our experience at Ukraine World is that there was a very big audience like February last year, March, then it went down, then it went up again in September when there was counteroffensive, in November when there was Kherson, then it went down right now. Now the anniversary, it's like huge attention. We are all tired of this. This is like incredible, but I'm afraid that starting from today, it's all over, or from the next week. What is your impression?
Hello, everyone. So my impression is the following. I think it's quite natural, like whether we like it or not, that the people get tired of the wars, and it's not about Ukraine. It's just human nature of getting tired of some sort of conflict. If everybody talks about that, so there will be, in my opinion, spikes and then declines of attention. I think in order to preserve this attention, we should just try to provide the world with some new perspectives and new narratives about Ukraine, new ways of looking at Ukraine, and also touch ground on something that people can better relate to. some stories, human stories, something that you can actually really relate to whenever you are in the globe. The Kyiv Independent experience in that is pretty much similar to yours, I would say. We also experienced a huge increase in our audience at the very beginning when Russia invaded Ukraine, when the full-scale invasion started on 24th of February last year. So our numbers of visitors on the website were, well, outspoken. We've never experienced anything like that. Well, but on a separate note, the Kyiv Independent at the time existed just a couple months. So yeah, I guess to sum it up, I just think that the world needs some new ways of looking at Ukraine, not to get tired of the stories that we already told. There should be new stories about Ukraine to widen up and amplify what Ukraine is, because Ukraine is not just the war. And that is also something that we've been discussing in the newsroom lately, how we don't want to be perceived as a media that solely reports about war developments, because Ukraine is not the war. Ukraine is way bigger, way greater. Ukraine has artists. Ukraine has its special vibe and spirit. Ukraine does inspire. I totally agree with Natalia. And I think that is also some kind of a narrative that should be reported on even more and more to show the world the new Ukraine, so to say, and to get the world inspired by Ukrainian people even more than they are now. And the only last thing I would mention is that I think it's the world, I guess, kind of tend to associate Ukraine with Ukraine's president, with Zelensky right now, which is also, I think, a little bit dangerous, even though useful at the moment, because him being an inspiration for the world really helps Ukraine to get both the attention it needs and the weaponry it needs, the financial support it needs, etc., etc. However, it also is dangerous in the case if something goes wrong and there is some bad PR, so to say, and then Ukraine would have to, well, his image will impact inevitably the image of Ukraine. So I think that is also some kind of an idea that we, all of us should think of.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think this kind of over-idealization of Zelensky is both tricky and dangerous. This is what we are trying also to explain with Tanya all the time, that it's not Zelensky who is leading the country, it's the country who is leading Zelensky in a way. And this is nothing wrong in this, so it's his role as well to feel the spirit. But when I tell my British friends, not Luke, but some others, why are you idealizing Zelensky so much? The response is very brilliant. Why are you idealizing Boris Johnson so much? And they're starting telling me lots of stories about Boris Johnson.
Don't get me started. I mean, sorry, you want to jump in, but can I just wanted to, sorry, am I mansplaining? No, okay, all right. I just wanted to take issue with your thesis that you know, today it's all downhill and there's fatigue. I think the evidence doesn't support that. And I also think there's a danger that by repeating that idea, you are kind of helping the Russians, because they want fatigue. They want the West to disengage. Their strategic calculation is that you know, European political leaders and the Americans, you know, maybe a change of leader in 2024, but the Europeans will flake. And that when they do kind of disengage, that will be the opportunity for them to prevail. And it's clear that Putin is shifting to a war economy. He's in it for the long term, and he's entrenching. So I think we have to be very, very careful. And just to say two things. One is the Guardian's live blog. I mean, if you haven't seen it, check it out. It's really very good. It's a fantastic rolling resource. It's done. I haven't got the data, but it's done millions and millions and millions of views. It's still regularly our most read thing on the Guardian website, which has got an absolutely global reach. So there's no evidence that people are not interested in Ukraine anymore. I mean, they are still very interested. And I think what's remarkable is the cohesion of the political coalition, the anti-Kremlin coalition, but also the continuing engagement on a kind of basic grassroots level. I mean, as Chris was saying, with the kind of flags. I mean, that is still the case. It's also the case in the UK. So I think, I mean, I was on, we had a Guardian editorial conference yesterday on Ukraine with about 10 of us who've been reporting here regularly, and I just sort of made a plea to my editorial colleagues. I'm saying we need to stick with it, and I think that message is getting across, not least because the department that is tasked with monetizing me got me to do a little video from Kherson where I basically say, we will stick with this story, give us some money, you bastards, and that's now, give us some money, you bastards, now on the website, and apparently it is raising more money. And just one last thing, I don't think the fact that we have Natalia and other brilliant people, Andrei Kirkov just sent me a piece today from Stanford, which he wants to place in The Guardian, that we have Ukrainian voices in The Guardian. I don't think it's exoticizing. I don't think it's some colonial, let's get the natives to write. I mean, I think basically I was saying again a year ago, let's not just get the middle-aged man from a university in the UK who's an analyst to write a piece from far away. Let's actually get some content from here. And one thing we did do, which I'm quite proud of, is we had a diary from Kherson. We had 2 anonymous diarists who are Ukrainians, both of whom then subsequently fled, writing about life under occupation for us. And they've actually been, they were nominated for a journalism prizes. So we're okay.
Thank you, Natalia.
I'd like to go on a bit more, develop this fight against the narrative about fatigue. I think that there is time, and it brought me some confidence to be, more confident in arguing. Volodya, I'm kind of considered to be very tolerant and moderate person when, talking to the people. I'm this tolerant voice from Ukraine, moderate voice from Ukraine.
I know how radical you can be.
But I actually, during the discussion, I really like to provoke these people, because sometimes it's just so much cliche in this journalism. So that would be always the question, always, believe me. So how is it to report your own war? You reported the other wars, and how is it? What they expect? They said, okay, it's very dear to see my own compatriots, suffering. And I usually say, wow, it's easier. It's so easier than to report foreign countries. Actually, I know the language, it's easier for me to get there. And then I said, do you think I felt less compassion to reporting the people after the bombardment of Aleppo? No, I feel compassion. Do you feel less compassion to Ukrainians than I do? Or you think I'm more compassionate to these people than you do? Is there something wrong with you? You don't compassion Ukrainians because they are foreigners? So, you really get into that. Sometimes the other thing about the fatigue, usually I sometimes say, I don't get the question. Sometimes I would say that, are we here to entertain you? Really? Wasn't enough of entertainment on the 24th? I think it's kind of big. What else should we do? But also you sometimes need to respond to these editors that, because it happened to be, you can put in responsibility, because once I was asked by the foreign editors, and I said, look, it's your country. Do you believe that Ukraine is important? You as an editor. So it's your task. Sorry, I can't help you. If you really believe, then it's your task to find it interesting for your audience. But the other thing, which I don't want to dismiss, and I think we need to use it, is of course Russia. Because I, of course, always try to build the Ukrainian story, the Ukrainian voice. But we all should understand that, as Ukrainians, of course, we are more interested in China than Taiwan, just because of the scale. There are big countries, they are always more interesting. We always would be more interesting in the US rather than in Canada, doesn't matter what. So in this regard, this war is partially popular because it's Russia. So the Russia would be popular. So we just need to, get into that and use it in our favor. Just being our own voice. So for instance, I do participate in the panels with the Russian journalists internationally. I'm actually very happy about that, because you just need to use it, because usually it works like that. Because I'm Ukrainian, I always speak in first. So then what they are doing, especially in front of the skeptical audience, in Italy, Germany, or any other countries, they would just say, I agree with everything Natalia said. And then all this German public or Italian public I'm look, you see. So I think that you just need to use this and find your ways a bit to sometimes how to work with that, and how also, use Russia for for us to make the story interesting, just report it from our perspective.
Thank you. Tanya?
I had just one remark about this Ukrainian fatigue. I remember for many months, starting from the February 2022 and until maybe September, I knew everything about the weather in Canada. Why? Precisely because the Ukrainian bloc was right after the weather forecast. So I knew everything about temperatures, about the wind, about the sun.
Did you make some conclusions for our daily life?
And then, so Ukrainian fatigue started back in maybe September, October. It was not daily, so it still was there. But what Natalia said is very important, because on the other side, what we don't mention and what we don't see, recently I've talked to a couple of people from Syria, who were reporting in Syria. And they were talking about this jealousy to Ukraine. And it comes not only from Syria, for sure, but also from Africa, from Francophone countries in Africa, from everywhere. About displaced people, but also about coverage, but also about what happened in Syria, when Aleppo and Mariupol. So the people said, look, when Aleppo was about to fall, our opinion was, if Aleppo falls, all humanity will fall. So, and nobody cared, in fact. So there were reactions, there were red lines by Obama, never respected, no proper reaction to that. And these people, they feel in a kind of in a double way, because on one way, they understand that if Ukraine wins, there could be some changes for that region as well, right? But at the same time, they feel kind of jealous about that Ukraine, when Mariupol is important, Ukrainian displaced people are important, Ukrainian is still, even if there is some kind of fatigue, is still in the top of discussion, and Ukrainian colors and Ukrainian flags are everywhere, and they feel like, why are they so different? If there any kind of, because why they are more important? Because they are more central, because they are in Europe, because they are white, and all kind of arguments are used to say that, look, why Ukrainians are not Syrians and not other people? There were many wars during these decades, and only Ukraine is this decisive war. So we should look at that side as well, and understand that even if some things seem that we are not so central, there are some other countries which feel that we are too more central in this coverage.
But my response would be that, well, if Ukraine wins, there is much more chances for democratization of Syria, for example. That's what I told initially. Let me ask, it will be my last question, but very, very important, I hope. And I will invite the audience to come in. So I think we should frankly talk about some stereotypes which were in the international media starting from 2014. And one of the key stereotypes, I think this is what was addressed to us all the time. I remember working as a fixer on Maidan, and every single journalist team, the first question would be, show me the far right. It's like when the Russians were coming with the war, show me where Nazis is, show me where the Banderis is. And this is, I think, my feeling was that this topic was so exaggerated. Of course it was present, it was like everywhere. Radicalism, right radicalism is everywhere a problem. But looking at the Ukrainian situation, it was so much over-exaggerated. And my basically kind of concern is that it helped overlook the real fascism, which is in Russia, which is in Moscow. So, and the perspective was wrong, because the real fascism is always where the state apparatus is, where the oppression apparatus is. What is your take on this? Luke and then Krzysztof.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. There was a problem. I mean, I think we at The Guardian, basically, we got it right. I remember talking to Alexei Haran in 2014, and I'd sort of been, some of this had washed over to The Guardian, and I said, look, let me go to Kyiv and write a piece about it. And he was complaining that he was getting email, someone who's on the Maidan organizing committee, getting emails from Harvard professors telling him that what had just happened in Kyiv was a neo-Nazi coup. And I wrote a kind of sort of vivid, evocative, analytically grounded piece pointing out this was an anti-corruption movement, that it was heterodox, that the first victim was Jewish, And I think it kind of cut through, but there just is an issue with the, and I'd be interested to see what Chris thinks about this, with the Anglo-American far left who just repeat this talking point. And clearly it's a Russian propaganda trope, but it's still doing the rounds because it resonates with certain people. I mean, how, you know, it's interesting, you say that the news organizations were asking you to find the far right. I mean, that is depressing. I think probably most have moved on from that. I mean, there was a lot of anti-Azov stuff as well to begin with. I think Mariupol, what happened there, the horror of Mariupol kind of changed that dynamic. But basically, we're dealing with Russian propaganda. And just on the point of fascism, I totally agree. I mean, I write this, I've been saying this, I argue this, that what Russia is doing is fascistic. This is a fascistic project. It's got a clear, I mean, Natalia has been working on this, a clear genocidal component. And I think we need to be very accurate about the terms we use. And I don't think we should be shy about calling Russian fascism fascism.
Chris?
I mean, I think as someone who's written a lot about extremism, and not only here, but American extremism, there are plenty of far-right people in America, just as there are in other Western countries. I mean, I think that the idea of writing about radicals, no matter where they are on the political spectrum, can be a sexy story for journalists, right? And during Maidan, I think that, you know, for example, the right sector group liked to talk a really big game and make it sound as though that they were, you know, more prevalent on the square and doing more important things than everybody else. So part of it was them, you know, creating their own narrative and being relatively media savvy. We saw with the original 2014 Azov Battalion, they were very media savvy, just like the Azov Regiment is now. I think in the coverage, which I think has gotten better over the years, but one thing that I think collectively the Western media fails on is how, for example, we'll talk about Azov because of the Mariupol defenders and the Azov Regiment being a key component to the defense of Mariupol. The Azov Battalion of 2014 hasn't existed since 2014. It was disbanded, it was brought into the National Guard, it's been a regiment for years. But people who are journalists who parachute in for a story once a year or haven't been here, they still have it in their mind that this battalion, the Azov Battalion of 2014, exists today as the Azov Regiment. And so they're out there looking for fascists or neo-Nazis within an organization that has, by and large, been reformed to a large degree. But as somebody who covered that Azov Battalion of 2014 and followed some of the leaders of it or founders of it on, I mean, they aren't necessarily actively involved, or were not necessarily actively involved in the defense of Mariupol and aren't associated as closely with the Azov Regiment, right? There is, I guess what I'm trying to say is there is this difference that isn't understood or is misunderstood by a lot of correspondents who haven't spent, say, as much time as myself and Luke have in this country. You brought up Russian fascism and why it may not have been covered or it not being covered as much. I mean, for myself, I can say I've been a Ukraine correspondent. I've done very little reporting in Russia proper. Luke was a correspondent or bureau chief there for years. He could speak probably better about covering
he suffered
Russia
from
as
the Russian fascism by then.
Sure. But we certainly weren't calling it that at the time, right? I mean, we were looking at Russia and its growing authoritarianism, but we weren't necessarily discussing it in the I think the context of fascism.
Just because I think there was a reluctance to among sort of mainstream commentators to believe that the Russian regime was as dark as it was, and that those of us who for a long time have been saying it's grown fascistic, and I would now say Russians turned into an absolutely totalitarian society, we were dismissed as a bit hysterical or over emotional or neocons. And it's funny, when I was writing my book, Invasion, my wife was saying, don't call it invasion, call it I fucking told you so.
I think I need to add, I think that, first of all, yeah, Russia is fascist and full stop, and it should be called this way. On Ukraine, look, the very same editor of mine in Ukrainian magazine who was so much complaining that the West kind of writes it too much about the radicals, was really in 2012, when I was writing a story from Egypt, was telling that I'm not really fully telling how radical are those Arabs, referring to Syrians. So, you know, I think that the stereotypes are there as well, that would be always, but for me important is that we cannot really, I think that there was also a part of the discourse among some of the Ukrainian intellectuals, because I think the strategy of denial is very bad. You just can't condemn some of the people who are doing wrong things, it's enough. But when you start to pretend that nothing is happening, there is no one this radical, you know, and you get in this emotional argument, of course it creates this vicious circle. Why are you denying? But clearly the guy has swastika. Why are you telling, you know? So I think that there was a bit of the problem for Ukraine of not able to express, you know, for instance, to condemn some of the people who are absolutely marginal, but openly condemned, saying like, that's marginal, they did wrong things, it's not good to attack LGBT pride, it's not good to do this, but they are marginal, instead of like having this kind of big discussion and sometimes trying to explain and find a lot of explanation. For me today, I think I very much hope that, and I had this discussion with some of the people from the far-right circle, you know, who were trying to explain they didn't mean anything by swastika. It kind of, they didn't mean seriously. It wasn't meant seriously. It just, you know, the tattoo was just there. And I think now everybody would understand that if I were ever anywhere globally would see some letter Z, I can't imagine that it would be, you know, mean something else. I cannot imagine that I didn't take it seriously. It was just there because, you know, it's historic, it's a, you know, 14-year-old guy playing with something. So I do think that these things are not really related, you know, like the fascism in Russia and, you know, our kind of not probably the best conversation we had about the far right in Ukraine.
Yeah, I understand what you mean, but there is another problem, I guess. And the problem is that for the Western societies, the key evil after the Second World War was kind of coming from something which is related to patriotism, question of identity, nationalism, etc. And not only swastika, it's not only the problem of swastika, it's a problem of any discourse which goes in that way, you know. And there is also a need to understand that when you talk about identity politics in the United States and when you talk about identity in Ukraine, there are totally different things. Because in Ukraine, evil was coming, you know, for decades, not that much from the far right, but from the far left. From the communism, which also had some fascist elements, but it's just completely different reality. And the problem of terminology, because you see any kind of a nationalist who is calling himself banderist or whatever, and you say, this is neo-Nazi. I mean, that's the problem. You can call him nationalist, you can call him, I don't know, somewhere else. But the problem of terminology, we really didn't clarify what fascism mean, what Nazis mean, etc. Nazism and fascism are ideologies which are actually using this state. And you cannot really call some groups of people, you know, using that name. That's my vision.
I wanted to just say one more thing real quick, because this is about stereotypes and narratives, and I think there's one that's potentially more damaging that I think is getting better, and that's corruption, right? That Ukraine has always been and remains a deeply corrupt country, right? And I'm guilty of it, as well as probably every correspondent that's written about Ukraine. At some point, we've used the words systemic corruption or endemic corruption or entrenched corruption.
It's like what vibrant civil society.
Right. But we've used all of
the
these
only response to systemic corruption is vibrant civil society.
But you know, I think that the issue of corruption has gotten better. I think the coverage of Ukraine in the context of corruption has also gotten better, and I think Ukraine being such a central focus of international journalism right now is a good thing. You know, but I think that has, you know, Putin's idea of Ukraine being a Nazi state and it needing to be denazified is obviously bullshit. And I think giving oxygen to that by saying this dangerous narrative of the far right fueled his desire to come in and control the country is, well, I think it's just false, right? Like, I don't truly believe that Putin actually believes that. I think it's just an excuse to do what he wanted to do, which is to subjugate Ukraine or completely destroy it, right? What is more damaging, because Ukraine relies so much on Western support and will continue to rely on Western support as it prosecutes its war against Russia's invasion, is the idea that it could have corruption that hasn't been cleaned up, right? That's why that narrative and that stereotype, I think, is potentially very harmful, and why it's so important to focus journalistic efforts and government efforts on dashing that, right?
So I can imagine that the next time the young group of young journalists comes from the first time in Ukraine and asks us to show us where the corruption is, right? So Tanya and Anya, very short comments from your side, and then I invite the audience to intervene.
Just one short remark about another cliche which is also damaging Ukraine, is about Ukraine as a post-Soviet country. So Nazi's country, but also post-Soviet. I remember this conversation with Pascal Bruckner in our podcast in French. He was saying, look, I asked him, what was your first impression about the war in Ukraine? He said, look, it looks so post-Soviet. He meant architecture, and sounds quite innocent, but this image of Ukraine as a post-Soviet, so Russia is post-Soviet, Ukraine is post-Soviet, what are you guys talking about? So this is also a damaging country.
And yet another stereotype of separatism, right? So that is a very damaging stereotype. I remember back in 2014 when Russia's first wave of invasion started, everybody was talking in the foreign media, maybe not everybody, that's an understatement, but many media outlets were calling what was happening in the Donbas as separatism, as Russia supporting separatists, etc., etc. And I was honestly quite surprised to see in September, when Russia was holding the forged votes to justify their invasion in Kherson, for example, there were still foreign media outlets calling that elections. It's not elections. No, these people are not separatists. There could not be any election at gunpoint organized by an occupying power. So, I mean, it's kind of clear, I think, for everybody, but still, as I said, I was quite surprised to see, for example, Reuters writing that there was a majority vote, people voted to join Russia, but, well, that's kind of a huge misconception.
Yeah, this is a strength of words. So Putin is using these words, I think, for reason, because it kind of, we all understand that this is fake democracy, fake referendum, but once the word referendum is pronounced, it can be taken. And I think the only counterweight to this is to explain how it actually went on. So when we went to Kherson and asked people how it was going on, people explain us, especially in the villages. Marina?
Thank you. Marina Beskorovina with the British Embassy, so thank you for the Boris Johnson remark at the very beginning. I was kind of not sure if the question I have would be the right for this forum, but I think that would sum up pretty nicely on the conversation. Luke, you have said at the very beginning that that was the case for quite a long time for journalists reporting on Ukraine being based in Moscow, which would give them very specific optics, because whatever you want it or not, if you live in a certain a location or a country for a period of time, it adjusts your optics, it adjusts your point of view. And it has been a plea of the Ukrainian side for quite a while as well to get international media moving regional offices to Kyiv. So my question probably would be to you and to Chris and whoever wants to comment, is this something you think we will see in the nearest future something we can expect? Because that, besides the quality of reporting, I think that would be quite a strong political image as well.
Yeah, I mean, briefly, I mean, for me, it's quite straightforward because I'm banned for life from the Russian Federation. So it's Kyiv or Kyiv. And also, to be clear, and perhaps just off the record...
Look, you're banned for life of the Russian Federation, not yours, you know?
Well, whatever. Anyway, it's okay. It can't be off the record. But let's say it's been quite hard for my colleagues to operate in Moscow. We should have two. We currently have one. The other one can't get a visa. Various people have been chucked out. I was chucked out, but a lot of people have been chucked out since me. And I think this rebasing is already going on. Actually, I mean, if you just look at the amount of dollars that have been spent, way more dollars have been spent in Ukraine on fixers, security guards, vans, drivers, hotels, sushi bars, you know, than in Moscow. So that's already happening. You know, we have a permanent Ukraine correspondent, a very good colleague of mine called Isabel Koshev, who's half British, half Ukrainian, and I think that will be the way. I think Kyiv, whatever happens to the war, will be a key node in Europe, and I think we'll have colleagues here. You know, to go back to your point of fatigue for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So it's happened. I mean, you wouldn't wish it to happen this way, but it has happened.
I mean, just to add real quick, I mean, I think a good example of that shift is the number of bureaus that have opened. So it's not just correspondence, but, you know, bureaus. Like, we have a small bureau at the Financial Times, right? With a full-time correspondent who's been working with the FT for 15, 16 years or something. And then they hired me on. The Washington Post has built out a bureau with a bureau chief and a team that somehow continues to grow, it seems. The New York Times has a bureau chief with a bureau here. And the number of resources that they're pouring in, that international media companies are pouring in, despite layoffs in the media industry, in the US in particular recently, has not seen any cuts here. And like I said, those bureaus being opened, you know, I think that's a sign that these organizations are here to stay for a while and have shifted focus already away from having that base in Moscow and seeing Eastern Europe through the lens of Moscow, I think.
It's interesting because I heard a completely different story from a German journalist who told me that there is a trend of cutting the local bureaus, financial prisons, obviously, and there is a big question, and therefore people probably will be relying on the local journalists much more. And
but that's a positive thing. I mean, that's been one positive change in the coverage. Is, I mean, every major international outlet has a team of fixers, producers, you know, reporters aiding them, which is extremely important because these are the people who know best, right? They have the inherent knowledge, the language skills, the cultural knowledge that is so important in covering a country, particularly one that's engaged in a war.
Good, good. Yes?
Good evening. My name is Anna Sitnikova. I work with topic of occupied Crimea, and my question was, today we mostly speak about Western audience and Ukrainian agenda in that countries. What about global South? Which kind of strategy we should use for broken these Russian narratives in this part of the world, and maybe some Ukrainian steps for broken that narratives? Thank you.
I'll get onto that because we, for instance, with the Reckoning Project, the next week we're publishing one of our big story for the anniversary of the first air bomb attack on Chernihiv in the major South African publication, in the Argentinian publication, in the Rappler, you know, the publication of Maria Reza, the former Nobel Peace Laureate. Unfortunately, I didn't have much time, you know, like really this year we understand we are a bit under resources to really talk because it's really complicated production to do that, but I think that the journalists are even open, but also there should be some kind of stories which are adapted, there should be more communication. Yesterday was very interesting with the President Zelensky conference, press conference, having their, you know, Argentinians, Brazilians, South Koreans, which also showed me a lot. I think probably the most remarkable part of that talk. And of course, I understand them. I actually feel for them because as a Ukrainian reporter, prior to the war, trying to report foreign stories, I understand how difficult it is to sell. So there should be the international project, there would be this cooperation. What is also very important, and I, by the way, should say that in this regard, Zelensky is doing his job. I had this small chance of being shortly in Kenya when there was the kind of a major anchor, being a great fan of President Zelensky, you know, really. And you just say that sometimes it's working like that. You need like a clear hero. So if he's a fan for a famous reporter in Kenya, in Nairobi, let him be. And I think we just need to build upon that. So the most important thing is for the Ukrainians really be cautious, because it's very easy to fail and make it wrong. Because what, for instance, Tanya was speaking about this competition, and it's true that you need to find the way how to talk to Syrians and explain, you know, why your story is there. I have my set of arguments saying Ukraine has the, you know, legit army to fighting. That's for the weapon is coming because it's not a rebel group. So you always can find an argument. And also, you cannot come to Africa and tell pity us, because, you know, when you talk to the journalists from Ethiopia, what's going on? There's horrible things happening now during the war. They have little international attention. Would you tell, you know, I'm living with the blackouts? So you really should move from the idea of this competition of the victimhood. You really can't expect that. So there should be very targeted agenda for each country. You cannot just tell like, hey, Global South, look at us. There is something for South Africa. There is a different story for French-speaking Africa, and we should be very cautious. I think the most important is to build these bridges, the human stories, based upon, you know, like struggle against all the kind of things, but really not just trying to, you know, tell like, pity us, you know, because we suffer, because we're coming to the places where people really suffer, and we honestly, we do not care. We have no idea what's going on. And by the way, I really just said that I'm a bit long, but I'm a bit, you know, I was also a bit annoyed because I remember that there was one Ukrainian who was very much speaking against some Egyptian journalists that they kind of get, you know, I don't remember, like there was something where they showed something in the festival, admitted some Russians, and like a person was bashing the Egyptian journalist for not being free-minded after the Arab Spring. And I said, like, have you ever, like, at least read what happened in Egypt after 2012? Because, you know, they're in jail, there are such a level of persecution that you can't imagine. Even foreign media journalists are in jail in Egypt. So, you know, if you really want some Egyptian solidarity, so before bashing Egyptians, at least Google what happened in Egypt after 2012. So I do think it's a homework, and I'm very cautious about being, you know, just kind of arrogant and demanding while approaching every single country.
I would add just one very brief practical thing. Look for connections. So the story around the blockade of the ports, the food supply, chain supply, just looking at who's losing out because of Russia's blockade of the ports, right? That's an easy way to look for a connection, find out where these shipments of grain or food supplies would be going, and then you've got a connection between Ukraine and those countries that are going to be affected, right? So just looking for connections.
And just one sentence about what could be done, and what we'll be hopefully doing in a couple of months. We will be organizing a press tours at Ukraine Crisis Media Center, press tours of journalists from Global South. What Natalia said, though, the cost of this reporting is also important. So if you bring a kind of funds for them to come here and to be in contact with the society, to travel a little bit, so it could be a way to establish contacts for them to see what's happening here. It could be some stories coming up here. They will be telling these stories in their language, in their vision. So our task is to bring them here, and we will hopefully doing that in coming months.
Just to say, I was recently in India at the Jaipur Literary Festival, and a couple of Ukrainian diplomats sort of came and were basically saying it's a bit of a struggle to get our message out. And certainly several people in the audience were saying it's all NATO's fault, which is very much the Russian line, which is kind of permeated in India. And I just made one point to them. I said, look, you know, India's got this close military relationship with Russia. You keep buying Russian stuff. And I said, do you think the Russians are going to be selling you their best stuff at the moment? You know, no. And I said, what happens to your Russian planes? And of course they all crash, killing Indian pilots. I said, it's not patriotic to buy Russian planes.
Very pragmatic, thank you. More questions? Remarks? Anybody in the room?
Does anyone think we're doing a good job?
Andrei Kruglashov, ICRC, we usually don't ask questions. I want to ask colleagues what already have changed in terms of language. Maybe you feel that there are proper words invented, you know, because the new reality requires new ways of framing it. And also regarding the suffering and victimization, I hear the point of not overselling it, focusing on dignity, on something that how people go through, but also what, to your opinion, in the stories brings it closer to the solution? Because indeed people with empathy ask often how, when it gonna end. And I was personally feeling uneasy with people saying like, I wish it ends fast, because I felt that fast it may end completely badly. You know, but what is the proper language of empathy and generating this empathy that leads to meaningful action to alleviate some suffering? That may be too much of a complexity I'm sprinkling in, but still, what words help you to get your message across, to drive people who read, watch your materials into the meaningful action to alleviate sufferings that are real, that exist, and that are prolonged and multiplied?
I mean, I would just say what I try to do, and I think we all try to do this, is to write with moral clarity, actually. And what we haven't talked about is the whole idea of false equivalence. I mean, there is a danger in journalism to sort of report what Russia says, report what Ukraine says, and allow, you know, the reader to conclude the truth is somewhere in the middle. And actually, I think this war shows that the truth isn't in the middle. The truth is with Ukraine and the Ukrainian cause. But you do have to fight against this. I mean, I was just reading this afternoon a review of my book, which came out in America, and it was, you know, quite a praising review, but was essentially suggesting that ultimately it wasn't dispassionate because it took what you might call a kind of Ukrainian or a Ukrainian sympathetic view. I mean, I just think our job as journalists, as writers, is to tell the truth. And I don't think there are multiple truths. I think there's a very clear, very morally defined truth in this context. And if we can tell that truth and we can tell human stories, then I think it's not that complicated. We just have to keep on doing that.
On the language and everything, I would pick up from Luke on speaking about like not being detached as well. I think we all, as Ukrainians, often ask, can we be objective? I always say, like, of course I am. I have no doubt that I'm objective, because by objectivity, I really mean sticking to the truth. If I know something is not true, I wouldn't tell it. Being emotional doesn't mean not being objective. I just recently, again, brought this example in the article of the firefighters, which were emotional. The brigade of the firefighters whom I met, they were crying. But still, they were stopping the fire, putting the fire, and doing their job. So that's for me the kind of an idea when I usually explain the job of a journalist. I am emotional. A policeman is emotional in Ukraine. A surgeon, yes, but still doing our job. But on the victims, you know, I think the most important thing is really, even if you tell the stories of the victims, it's really how do you feel about them? Do you pity these people? Or you respect them and treat them as a people who overcome something? And I think that was a question when I was asked, like, what is your reporting a bit different? I report our team, we have 20 journalists spread out around country, And for a year, we're reporting war crimes, crimes against humanity. So what we do in-depth interview with a huge level of details about what people witnessed. Tortures, beating, murders, executions, really graphic, horrible stories, you know. So, you know, like if you work for a year with war crimes, it's about the victims. But if you really speak about people as survivors, as people who have their dignity, who are just, they are not asking for pity, they're asking for solidarity and for accountability. And I also think it's also coming not that much international or national. I've seen incredibly great journalists like Luke and everybody, incredibly international journalists who are coming. And, you know, in this war, in the war reporting, there are a lot of people who do this for ego. You know, they do incredibly good stories, they can make it exclusives, but it's just like ticking a box. I remember I was so annoyed, I will tell this story. I was so annoyed, I was driving with the journalist, it was first days of the war, and we happened to be in one car from Odessa to Mykolaiv. Mykolaiv was almost considered under the siege. And, you know, she reported she came from Syria, and I understood that she's superb. She's like a superb, you know, perfect journalist. And she was doing everything right, you know. Bring me a pregnant woman, let's go to a maternity ward, how she is about to deliver under the bombs. Let's do this and that. Everything sound, and I later read the paper. It was a good story, you know, like more exclusive than something which maybe others were doing, because she was very, very, very good in that, but it was really more or less about her coming to this place. I was doing back then this story about Vitaly Kim, because that was the most interesting story in Mykolaiv at that time, to be honest, because it was one very regular story about, you know, another Ukrainian town under the bombs. So I also think that it's not always about just Western or not Western. There is a lot of good journalism, there is a lot of bad journalism. There was a lot of good journalism done by people who treat the people they talk with a dignity. There are the people who treat the journalists to whom they talk with arrogance. And that's not something I'm a fan of. But I think this movement from even like when we are sometimes we are, you know, corrected to say, like, don't speak about the victims as the victims, they're survivals. These things matter. They change your mindset, and you really, you know, start to be careful about this attitude.
I just wanted to add, you asked about solutions, how to provide solutions to people with empathy. I think solution in our case equals accountability, and I think that is where we talk about stories of how to bring Russia to account and how to provide, well, how to create this framework, legal framework, where Russia could eventually face the music and Russia's establishment could be punished for their war crimes. And there come the stories explaining what can be done, how it can be done, interviewing experts and looking into creation of this framework.
More questions?
Yeah, hi, I'm Oscar. I'm the singular voice of Iceland, the social democratic utopian island in the middle of the Atlantic here in Ukraine. And it's very interesting, this discussion has been a lot about language and the use of words and semantics and all that kind of stuff. Iceland, this is going to be, yeah. So Iceland has never been in a war, ever. We don't have an army. Our police don't have guns. We're like the most peaceful ever.
But you have fantastic sagas.
Yes, yeah, that's the problem. So the thing is, I'm the journalist from Iceland here in Ukraine, and I have to translate all these fancy war words from you Brits or you Americans into Icelandic, and we don't have the words. We don't have the words for artillery. You know, there's the same word for artillery shell, artillery person, artillery gun, artillery. It's the same word. So that's like, it's interesting. It harkens back what he was talking about, like empathy and all this stuff, and like words and semantics and whatever. Emotions carry, like, what I found out when I'm trying to, like, because all our words are either from, like, talking about the Second World War in 1940s. So, like, they all sound like, you know, like this newscaster in the movies, you know, like this kind of, it's just old-timey. Or from the sagas, you know, a war, a place where we fight war is Vígvöllur. That comes from the sagas. It's like a 2,000-year-old word, you know, and that's what I have to use when I write about war. But the thing is, like, what I found out is that it is true that emotions, they kind of translate anyway, you know, we kind of relate. If we can find a way, instead of using the words, we can describe the emotion that we're talking about. And so, like, yes, of course, we can quibble over the semantic question all day long and like what words to use or whatever. We can find a way. We're clever people, intellectuals, and that's why we're sitting here. But yesterday, I watched a super secret screening here in this building, and I cried for 90 minutes straight. And like, that was showing victims, that had a narrative that was done by a brilliant journalist who is Ukrainian. Like, it doesn't really matter, like, in my opinion. This wasn't a question. This was just like the statement from the Icelandic representative. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Iceland. I was just going to add. I think you know, you mentioned the film yesterday, which I still haven't watched yet. I got stuck at the president's press conference all evening.
And you also cried for 90 minutes.
I cried for 90 minutes as well, just for a different reason. You almost made me forget what I was going to say. But I think something like that, like the Mstislav's and film, you know, something like that, I think transcends language and the barrier, right? On a lighter note, something I've actually enjoyed is the mishmash of languages used while covering this war. Like Zelensky more than once yesterday was speaking Ukrainian, but then would pepper his speech with English words to also describe various artillery systems or things associated with the war.
And he got it wrong quite a lot, actually. Yeah, his English seems to have got worse. If you ask me.
But he's also very tired. I mean, I do it myself in speaking Russian to some people, English to others, forgetting the terms in English or Russian for various things, or Ukrainian. I sort of look at it as like we're all now speaking a wartime version of Surzhyk. And I lived in Bakhmut for 2 years, between 2010 and 2012, and I went out there having studied Russian and spoke Russian with most people, but immediately noticed that the accent was different, and there were words that I did not understand, and why is this happening? And of course I learned that there were plenty of Ukrainian-speaking people around the Donbass, but they also spoke a form of Russian, and that this thing was called Surzhyk. And now I sort of feel like we're in this wartime, you know, period where we're all speaking this kind of, you know, war Surzhyk lingo. Anyway, again, not a question, but just an observation, a statement to Iceland.
But there is much more connections between Iceland and Ukraine than we think, because Icelandic sagas is a good source for Ukrainian medieval history. So let's not forget.
I just really want to say, because just yesterday you were, you know, I think for 15 minutes were talking about this, listening from a Ukrainian colleague about how great work you do for Iceland. So, you know, you need to understand your work is famous, appreciated. So please go on. Thank you.
Yes, please.
So my name is Jelle Kriens. I'm a photojournalist. I've worked with Luc as well in the past during the year of war. And I guess my question is, what do you think of the visual language that's been used in the international coverage of the war so far? Is it accurate? Is it complete? What are you missing? Just your thoughts in general.
Could I put that question back to you, because you're the photojournalist? How do you think it's been? I mean, not talking about your own work, but in general.
Sure. So my work. So I've spent around 4 months in country since the beginning of the invasion, but I've not spent time before the invasion. So I think my question more is, as Ukrainians and as people who've covered Ukraine and Ukraine-Russia relations for longer than me, do you think the coverage, the visual language has been accurate? Because from my perspective, what I've seen on the ground does is represented in the visual language that I've seen in the big international outlets. But I'm just curious as to your opinions as Ukrainians and as more experience, more journalists with more experience in the country.
I'll just say very briefly, I think there's been some absolutely brilliant work, your stuff included. There's been some fantastic photojournalism from Ukrainian photographers. So you think about, Arrest and Azovstal. I mean, my book is coming out next week in Czech language, and his photo of the soldier with a ray of light streaming down on his head is the front cover of the book. So it's been brilliant, it's been resonant, it's gone across the world. I mean, the only thing I think it misses, especially TV, is scale. Because you look at the grammar of TV news, there's a natural disaster, you put the reporter in front of the worst affected building, and then you're used to that being the kind of visual backdrop. What that doesn't communicate in Ukraine is the fact this front line is more than 1,000 kilometers long. So you can drive for hours from a ruined village to another ruined village, and you can't put that in a TV report because it's just too huge, it's just too epic, it's just too awful. So you need, I guess you need written language to do that, but overall, I think you guys have done an amazing job.
I think some of the best photographs that I've ever seen have come out of the past year, and I could speak for quite a while about which ones those are and why they're great, but to keep this short, because I'm sure we all have to go soon, I find myself, as not a photojournalist, a bit of a purist, and I like the images that I see that feel and look raw and real and not staged. And the one thing I've noticed in the last several months is that there are a lot of photographs that appear staged to me. For example, soldiers pulling a ripcord and firing artillery, and another soldier standing there going, like, I don't think they do that when the camera's not there. And then I see, and my outlet is guilty of this as well. I think we've published some of those photos that end up going to the wires, the AP, Reuters, Getty, etc., as like a lead image in our stories. I try to make sure that those images are not always or often included, because I don't think it gives a realistic depiction of the war as I've seen it and experienced it in the trenches with Ukrainian soldiers, not only this year, but over the past 9 years. So that is the only, and it's not necessarily a constructive criticism, it's an observation, certainly not directed at you, but you asked what we see, and I see that, and it makes me feel a little icky sometimes. I think that the photos that have done really well, which are not only by international correspondents, but especially Ukrainian photojournalists, some of which we've already brought up, Zhenya Melavika, etc., have been some of the most powerful and deeply moving images that I've ever seen. And I think that those images have, are largely responsible for the amount of attention that this war has gotten from the West as well. I think those images of Mariupol galvanized the international community. The images of Bucha galvanized the international community. It made, and this kind of goes to the question about solutions as well, like publishing that type of material, showing the brutal reality and not a staged event or photograph, does a lot more to get people behind you and to support you.
Yeah, and I just want to say, I think that's probably for me is one of the things that the international media has done right this year with Ukraine, is that there have been many Ukrainian photographs that have gotten the space as probably as also, as you said, writers. Do you also agree with that, or you think there could have been more?
No, I do think that brilliant job of the photographers, and I know what the photographers for the last years were nagging that, social media there are so many citizen journalism, but especially this war showed what is a difference and why the professional photographers are doing that so much differently, because it is a profession. And I think they need to appreciate actually something that they also complain often is the social media, because I do think that you know, we're on Twitter, but I'm exactly the one who kind of struggled to be there all the time. But actually the photographers from Bucha, from Mariupol, also not being just on the front page, but during these short tweets, they had immense power. So the photography even more important. One thing which is always puzzling for me, but it's more because I'm thinking a lot about the visuals of the war photography and the visuals during the war as such. Of course, they are usually about, you know, the harder things, about the most emotional. And they always create a bit a different picture of the country and the place because, and it's like the movies. People see just like this part of Ukraine. However, of course, we understand that Ukraine is not like that, because the people would ask how destroyed Kyiv is, you know, just because that's the images of Ukraine under the war. But there is no solution. It's generally the things which happening to Iraq, to any other places, that you always would film this one destroyed building, and, you know, you wouldn't have the photos of the outskirts. I think that there is a lot of storytelling with photographs happening still, but there is no answer on that. It's quite a challenge how to balance the normalcy and the war at this time.
Yeah, this is a very difficult story, the normal life despite the war, and how we continue trying maybe sometimes to imitate the normal life. But if you are gone with the normal life, it actually means that you lose the battle with the war in some sense. Not only inside the war, but the battle with the suffering and with the pain. And this is also another battle, the second one. I think we can end on this and come to an informal discussion, as long as we see the tendency that the question is actually brought back to the person who asked this question, so we can follow up with the informal discussion. Thank you so much for our panelists, Luke, Tanya, Natalia, Anna, and Christopher. I think it was very fascinating discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.